All these animals, despite their obvious differences, are molluscs.
How did this extraordinary adaptive diversity arise? Well, we can go some way towards answering this, because not only are molluscs well represented by living forms, but their hard shell, with its variety of distinctive features, has good fossilization potential. And so the phylum is also well represented in the fossil record. Comparison of fossil forms that are clearly similar to, but again different from the living forms you've just been looking at, allow us to reconstruct the evolutionary pathways of the molluscs. Despite this diversity of form, it seems that all molluscs are really built according to the same basic body plan. They are, if you like, variations on a theme. Now, what is this basic body plan? Let's build it here in the studio. Like most of us, they're equipped with a bag of guts, and with, of course, the associated excretory and reproductive systems. This is called the visceral mass. At the front end, it has a mouth, and at the back end, an anus. The molluscan mouth is typically equipped with rather a special thing, a strip of tissue called the radula. And the radula is drawn in conveyor belt fashion over a tongue-like cartilage inside the mouth, and thereby this scrapes in food material to assist the feeding of the animal. Okay, so we have our basic visceral mass. How does it move around? Well, it moves around on a broad muscular sole to the body that is known as the foot. In fact, the sides of the foot extend up as muscular sheets, enclosing the body mass of the animal here. So we now know how the animal deals with its food and how it moves around. How is it protected on this exposed dorsal surface? Well, basically with a shell. But how does it produce the shell? It produces the shell by secretion from a broad sheet of tissue known as the mantle. Imagine that I am going to catch hold of the flap of skin around the top of the animal, and I'm going to pull it down over the sides of the animal to form a sort of skirt. Here is that skirt. And this, as I said before, is referred to as the mantle. Over the dorsal surface of the mantle, secretion of calcareous shell material takes place, giving the animal a dorsal protective shell. If you look closely, you can see that the shell enlarges with growth of the animal by means of the addition of marginal increments. Well, of course, our little mollusk needs to respire. How does it do this? If I lift the specimen up rather carefully and turn it over, you can see underneath that there is a cavity lying between the edge of the foot and the mantle skirt. This is known as the mantle cavity. Hanging down inside the mantle cavity from the sides of the body are a number of simple leaf-like gills. And it is by means of these, of course, that the animal respires. In this model, we've shown multiple gill pairs because this is believed to be the primitive condition in molluscs. Though I should point out that most living molluscs only have one pair of gills in the mantle cavity. Okay, so our basic mollusk then consists of various soft parts enclosed by a hard calcareous shell. But of course, it's only the shell that's going to be preserved as a fossil. How can we ever tell anything about the soft parts of these ancient organisms then? Well, we're lucky, because on the insides of molluscan shells, one frequently sees muscle scars. Such muscle scars, which are shown here arrowed, tell us about the basic organization of the animal's body, and we can therefore reconstruct its anatomy. The simple manner of shell growth by incrementation, which I showed you earlier, has some very important evolutionary consequences. If simple conical increments are stacked during shell growth, then a simple conical shaped shell results. If, on the other hand, the expansion rates of these conical increments are varied, then shells of varying tallnesses are produced. Some are flat and some are tall. If, on the other hand, growth at the margin does not take place at the same rate all the way around the opening, wedge-shaped increments are produced with rather different consequences. Coiled conical shells result. In these examples, the increments are symmetrical about one plane, so that the shells produced are planispiral, that is to say, they're coiled in the same plane. The increments may have no symmetry about any plane. Though the increment may be the same shape as the previous one, the result is that these will stack in an offset way and produce a coiled conical shell with what is called trochospiral form. Finally, all the shell models you've looked at so far have had flat apertures. Now, if the aperture itself is curved and wavy, then the increments are saddle-shaped, and this produces a variety of different shell shapes, such as this one here. So this simple means of shell growth, by means of incrementation, can produce a wide diversity of shell shapes. You could say that our primitive mollusk here, as it were, has the potential to produce all these different kinds of shell forms. Well, I call this primitive. I did this because it is really a distillation of all the features that are interpreted as primitive in different molluscan groups. It's therefore an archetype. Now, as you're probably aware, the problem with archetypes is that they are little more than a catalogue of primitive features from widely different groups of organisms, and they don't really come together to produce something that works as a single integrated whole. So it's reasonable to ask, did anything like the molluscan archetype ever exist? Well, the mollusks are rather extraordinary because there is an animal that looks peculiarly like the molluscan archetype that is alive today. It's a member of an obscure little class of primitive mollusks known as the monoplacophora. This particular example is called Vima. You could, I suppose, describe it as the coelacanth of the molluscan world, because the monoplacophorans were thought to have been extinct a long, long time ago, and yet living monoplacophorans such as this have been dredged up since only the beginning of the 50s. Let me just remind you what the underside of our basic molluscan body plan looked like. And here is the undersurface of Vima. Quite similar, isn't it? It's got the same conical kind of shell. And at the front end of the animal, there is a little mouth, which is equipped with a radula, behind which is a broad muscular foot, which is attached to the shell by a variety of multiple pedal muscle scars. Around the foot is a mantle cavity containing numerous simple gills. I'd point out, though, that these rather finger-like gills in the monoplacophoran shown here are not quite like our simple leaf-like gills of the model, and there is some debate as to how primitive or specialized the gills of Vima and its allies are. What's more, the primitive status of the monoplacophora is attested by the fossil record. Collections of the earliest known molluscan fossils from the Timoteian stage at the very base of the Cambrian are dominated by monoplacopherans, such as this shell here, Lartuchella. I should point out that all these molluscan shells at this stage are very, very tiny, just about pinhead-sized. Here's a model reconstruction of Lartuchella, and you can see that although it's clearly a monoplacophoran, it has undergone a degree of specialization already. It has a very tall, forwardly inclined shell. Because of this narrowing of the shell, it seems likely that the mantle cavity inside was rather restricted, and quite possibly the gills were restricted to just a single pair in a more posteriorly positioned mantle cavity. Of course, the pedal muscles shown here coming up from the foot and attaching to the inside of the shell are quite conjectural, because no muscle scars have yet been recorded from Latouchella. Muscle scars have, however, been recorded from the insides of some later monoplacophorans, such as Pylina here from the Silurian. You can see, arrowed, a number of multiple pedal muscle scars, which are typically associated in the monoplacophora with their broad, creeping foot. You will recall that I said just now that Latouchella already shows a degree of specialization. Indeed, looking at the various Tomotian mollusks, two evolutionary trends are already apparent right at the beginning of the Cambrian there. First of all, there are tall shells, such as Latouchella here, in which the gut was presumably hunched, and these are known as certasoma, meaning hunched body. They mark the inception of a new molluscan subphylum. The second trend is exhibited by this tiny little shell called Heroltipegma. It comprises lateral compression of the shell with increasing curvature of the aperture, shown here by an arrow. It's probable that the gut ran directly from front to back in this animal, and for this purpose they are referred to the subphylum Diasoma, meaning through body. Heroltipegma can be linked to the other monoplacophorans via such shells as Anabarella here, which show the characteristic cap-shaped shell with forward curvature, but also show a degree of lateral flattening and some incipient curvature of the aperture. In this model here, you can see the curvature of the aperture and the lateral flattening of the shell with its hoop-like aspect when viewed from the front end. This contrasts with the flat aperture of the other monoplacophorans, such as Latouchella, which presumably crawled around on flat surfaces, and it's supposed that forms like Anabarella ploughed through soft sediments like this. Heroltipegma, then, seems little more than an exaggeration of the shell forms seen in Anabarella. I'd like to remind you again that all these forms were living together during the Tomotian stage, right at the very beginning of the Cambrian. So this much diversification had taken place within less than 5 million years. Now, Heroltipegma was the first member of a new class of mollusks known as the Rostroconchia. And here is an example of one of them, Aoteria. You can see that it's got the extremely curved aperture typical of the rostroconchs, and if we look beneath it, you can see how narrow this aperture is. Notice how bilobed the shell is, but still nevertheless in one piece. Here is a reconstruction of a rostroconch, such as Aoteria. Notice the typical bilobe form of the shell which you've just been looking at. Now imagine that I am going to cut away half of this shell so that we can have a look inside it. Well, first of all, you can see this flap-like mantle lobe, which would have secreted that part of the shell. And this is joined to the inside of the shell by a thin band of muscular tissue here. Inside that is a blade-like foot inserting into the shell via these strands here, which would have assisted in digging, for the animal was probably some kind of a burrower. Lastly, how did the animal feed? Well, it's supposed that there were probably tentacular extensions of the mantle at the front end of the animal, and that the animal lived buried in the sediment, collecting in food particles with these tentacles. This is how we think the animal lived in the sediment, with the back end of the shell just projecting out into the water above. The most important part of the rostroconch legacy was the molluscan class Bivalvia, which first arose in the Atdebanian stage, the second stage of the Cambrian, with a little form known as Fordilla. Fordilla is a tiny little bivalve shell. You can see how small it is in this rock specimen here. I'm pointing at it there. I've got a recent example of a bivalve here to show you how it works. You can see that it's really only a slight extension from the rostroconchs. Instead of having a single bilobe shell like the rostroconchs, the bivalves have two distinct valves, with the central part having become flexible so that it now acts as a ligament, a flexible ligament, which tends to push the two valves apart. Correspondingly, inside the shell are muscles known as adductor muscles, which tend to pull the two valves together. This system of adductors and ligament in the bivalve shell, coupled with the digging foot, which you can see down here, makes the bivalves extremely efficient burrowers. That then is an outline of the diasome radiation. The certosomes underwent an even more spectacular radiation. This is an example here of a later monoplacophoran called Certolytes. The certosome showed a more spectacular radiation. The shell is yet further extended and taller, and in order to be more compact, has become planispirally coiled. You will observe that the pedal muscle scars shown on this internal mould of a shell here are quite high up inside the shell, which would have given plenty of space down the back, the posterior part of the shell, for a large posterior mantle cavity in which the gills would have lain. Here is a model of a similar planispiral monoplacophoran called Sinuitopsis from the Devonian. And you can see some of the features I've just been talking about. First of all, here are the pedal muscles coming up from the foot and inserting deep inside the shell, leaving at the back end of the shell an extended mantle cavity wherein there was probably one elongate single pair of gills. Not all the early coiled monoplacopherans were planispiral, however. There are many forms such as this little shell Pelagiella here, which comes from the Atdebanian, which are quite clearly trochospirally coiled. You can see how the apex of the shell is offset. It's been suggested that this asymmetry of coiling related to the animal wearing the shell on one side, as it were, in life, so that the spar would coil upwards above the head. Now, it was amongst such trochospiral forms that a very important evolutionary event seems to have occurred: torsion. During torsion, the forwardly pointing coiled shell rotates backwards by about 180 degrees anti-clockwise over the foot, so that the coil now comes to lie at the back end of the animal. This has the effect of bringing the mantle cavity up above the head. Torsion heralds the beginning of the class Gastropoda. This little shell here, Aldenella, is amongst the earliest of the gastropods. It occurs in the Tomotian stage, with many other of the shells that we've been looking at during this program. You can see that it's rather more strongly trochospirally coiled than Pelagiella.
Gastropods retain the creeping foot and radula of primitive mollusks, but torsion has allowed the evolution of a complex head which can be drawn into the now anterior mantle cavity.
Meanwhile, other certosomes developed more upright shells, such as Nitoconus here, which comes from the Upper Cambrian. Nitoconus itself shows an interesting additional feature. The apex of its shell is chambered off, as you can see in this cutaway diagram.
From forms such as Nitoconus, there arose the cephalopods, using the now interconnected chambers of the shell as a buoyancy tank. The foot, released from creeping, became reduced to a funnel for jet propulsion, the bellows being formed by the mantle cavity.
The first known cephalopod is this beast here, known as Plectronostris, which comes from the Upper Cambrian. You can see that it is rather like Nitoconus, only somewhat more extended. And another thing has happened. If we look at the shell in section, we can see the same septa that there were in Nitoconus, but this time punctured on the right side by the siphuncular tube.
Most recent cephalopods have a lost or reduced shell, but remain active predators.
What conclusions can be drawn from this brief survey of molluscan radiation? Well, it seems that somewhere near the beginning of the Cambrian there arose the first monoplacopherans, which had a simple cap-shaped shell produced by marginal incrementation. This simple means of growth had the potential to produce a wide diversity of different shell forms. You could perhaps say that the monoplacopherans were pre-adapted to all that came later. And indeed, these options were rapidly taken up during the Cambrian by the emerging molluscan classes. Straight away, two trends developed, the certosomes and the diasomes. And from the certosome trend, all within the first 5 or so million years of the Cambrian, there developed trochospiral coiling and torsion in the gastropods to give efficient creeping. And on the other hand, amongst the diasomes, there developed this blade-like shell form for efficient burrowing, which was to lead within a short space of time to the rostroconchs and the bivalves. Somewhat later in the Cambrian, tall certosome shells with chambers became cephalopods, where the chambers were used as buoyancy tanks. And so, in the relative ecological vacuum of the early Cambrian, the pre-adaptive potentials of the monoplacophoran shell and mantle cavity were rapidly exploited by the different molluscan classes.